Well, welcome back to another episode. And we're continuing on this label review series, which I know I keep saying I love it, but I do because it's fun. We're learning about new brands, but we're also learning the facts about different brands. And I want to say that this is the first brand that is listener submitted. So we are always checking our email. It's the best way to hit us up right now. So it's just hello@feedyourdogfacts.com. It's just our email. And you can submit things like this of like, hey, can you review this brand? Can you review that brand? So we did have a listener write into us that said he was looking into getting Visionary Pet Foods brand for his dog, and he wanted our thoughts on it. So we are going to dive in. And this is our first quote unquote keto dog food, right, Dan? Like we've been reviewing all these brands that have like super high carbs, and we talk about the nutrition around it. But this is the first time that we're coming across a very low carb dog food.
Yep, that's right. It's not a common thing. You know what I mean? It's really Visionary and Keto Natural are really the only two brands where that is the central thing they're making. Like that's the one of, if not the key selling point about the product. The vast majority of pet food brands are trying to communicate meatiness and a lack of carbohydrate without explicitly saying so and without actually delivering on that. It's all this implication, whether it's wolf language, meat language, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
And so we're on an island. I mean, it's like, it's, just to not to like, spoiler alert, but like this will be a pretty positive review. Like what these guys are doing, in my judgment, is really solid. I think of it as being like, we're on an island with them. And as far as kibble goes, that's kind of it. There are a few that are close by, but like it's really our brand and their brand are the two really unique ones. There are differences, we'll get into them, that make one or the other a better fit for specific consumers, are real differences. But the vast majority of other brands are like not even close.
Right. Yeah, exactly. When you look at the percentage of carbs in a dog food, I agree with you. It's Visionary and Keto Natural together. And then it's like, 20-30% plus above, in carbohydrate percentage in other dog foods. So anyway, let's start there. Let's talk about the nutrition. Let's talk about the nutritional content. We do have their website up for those that are watching. So we'll kind of reference a couple of visuals on there in terms of what we are talking about. But Dan actually bought a bag too. I want to mention that too. So he has in his room an actual bag, because that is part of our process too. We want to like open it, look at the front, look at the back. Sometimes websites don't have all the information. So Dan has a bag of Visionary Pet Food ready to look at any time.
Their kibbles are larger than ours. That is not a substantive difference, although it might, depending on what the particulars of your dog and your situation, make it a better or worse fit. For instance, if you have a very little dog that doesn't, like you do, makes it difficult for the dog to eat anything that's a particularly big chunk of hard food, a smaller kibble might be better. On the other hand, if you got a large dog, maybe arguably a large kibble is better, but it's not a substantive difference. It doesn't do different things within the body just based on the size.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, cool. So let's hop into this website. Beautiful packaging, very easy to read in terms of the benefits of the recipe. And let's kind of start with the guaranteed analysis for protein and fat, good, bad, kind of walk us through that.
No problem. I would love to. But let me say one thing first. Can you pull up the image of I mean, I can hold mine up too, but yours is like easier to see. One thing I'll note for everybody is that the language low carb is featured in several places on that. And it's obviously true. We'll get to the nutritional content in a second. By anybody's definition, this is low carbohydrate content. That said, that term is prohibited by AAFCO's model regulations. You're not allowed in AAFCO's eyes to use the term low carb or low carbohydrate or low starch. That's part of the existing regulatory infrastructure. So what they're doing by using it is something I basically support. It's kind of like they're saying we're telling people something that's true. This is a ridiculous rule. Come stop us if you really think you want to enforce this, come find us and stop us. They're like it's blatantly in violation of a bad rule. You know what I mean? And so for us, we're much more circumspect about using that language because when we weigh, I mean, if you're selling pet food in the US, you have to deal with individual state regulators. So, like, if you make one regulator in the state of Illinois upset and they don't like you, then they can make your life really difficult. They can say, you got to change this label or else you're not allowed to sell your product in our state. But with the other thing that it means is like you've got 50 different small offices at these different states that are charged with policing the bags of every brand of pet food sold in the state. So it's a huge like task for them and they're understaffed. And in a lot of cases, brands like they're doing here will just be like, okay, this is a ridiculous rule. They're not doing, in my judgment, again, they're not doing anything that's wrong, like morally so. They're afoul of the rules for sure, but that's because the rule is bad, not because what they're doing is bad. But like I said, like we're just like I've made the choice that like we're going to be somewhat more circumspect about that and not poke the bear as much as they are here, and instead try to communicate the low carbohydrate content of the product through the numbers on the label primarily. We still use the expression in some places, but like not nearly as prominently as this. So that's probably an interesting little nugget. Like when you don't see that term,
interesting.
Obviously that term low carb is used much more in human food products and in like online discourse outside of specific products. People talk about the low carb community. So it's a very common term, but in pet food, you don't see it very often. And that's why. Yeah, and because there aren't that many brands that could say it. Like even if it wasn't illegal,
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, even in that orange band, they have keto and low carb, like keto low carb food for dogs. I mean, that in and of itself is something you rarely see anywhere on the shelf, as you said. So yeah, that's a great point.
And we'll get into I think like the significance of keto as we start talking about the nutritional content. So,
yeah.
Anyway, nutritional analysis. So they're guaranteed. So in terms of what is in the product, truly low carbohydrate content to the tune of 1 gram of digestible carbohydrate per serving per cup. So really low. That's each gram of digestible carbohydrate typically contains about 4 calories. So they have less carbohydrate in their product than Ketona has in it. It's completely, it's an edge case. It's like, if the vast majority of kibbles are, multiple potatoes, they're like whatever 1/20th of a potato, and we're like 1/14th of a potato or something like that. It's quite similar, but they're like truly low in carbohydrate content. Couldn't deny it. Their fat number is 33%, whereas ours, it varies by recipe, but it's like half that basically.
Okay.
And that's kind of the biggest difference nutritionally between their product and ours, is that ours is somewhat higher in protein content, somewhat lower in fat content than theirs. Theirs is higher in fat, lower in protein. And that's kind of when people write in and they say, I'm considering you or Ketona or this product, what are the differences? How would you defend your product? I would say, look, this is sort of it. If you believe that a higher fat, lower protein content is better for your dog, you want theirs. If you're the other way around, you want ours. That's sort of how it goes. I'm not a big, their fiber number is 7%. I don't even know off the top of my head. what our guaranteed analysis crude fiber number is. But like in either case, and we'll get into this when we discuss the significance of the nutritional numbers, the fiber is not that number is not something that I think is particularly significant in judging the healthfulness of a product, because the fiber essentially passes through the dog without being digested. Like protein and fat and dietary digestible carbohydrate all gets broken down during digestion and goes into the bloodstream and contributes to nutrition. Fiber is different. Indigestible fiber just passes right through the animal. It's why that you hear so often people talk about fiber intake with regard to like digestive regularity and like doggy stool quality, is because that's just stuff that just like flushes the system. It just like goes directly through the animal. So not a big difference there. Their moisture content is 10%, which I believe is exact same as ours. So yeah, it really boils down in terms of the nutritional content, really boils down to lower protein, higher fat.
Cool.
And I have a lurking huge puppy eyeing up this bag of dog food, like just out of camera. My puppy Wayne is like, yo, what do you got?
He's there? Like, wait a second, this smells different than ketone.
Yeah, let me get that.
And of course, this one also has on its packaging complete and balanced, which we always recommend for complete and balanced for all life stages, which we always recommend. Make sure this is on your dog packaging, please, for your dog. But also, let's kind of go back to the front of this package, because this was something that I was talking about with you right before we started recording. And I was saying to you, I've never seen this on dog food packaging before. I've seen it on like keto human, snacks and human keto food, but never on dog food. Is this concept at the very bottom of its packaging, this little tiny lettering, they call out net carbs. Right. So yeah, let's kind of walk through that concept.
Yeah. Okay. So net is kind of like, I always think about it in business terms, like gross is like top line. Like that's the amount of total money coming into the business. If you talk to like gross revenue, or like gross income is your income before you subtract out something. So like gross revenue is just the total amount of dollars worth of dog food or whatever else your business sold. Gross income is the amount that your paycheck is before you take any taxes out of it. Whereas net income is that gross pay. Say your salary is $50,000 a year, gross pay is 50, minus your taxes that are being withheld with every check, leaves you with your net income. Net is like inclusive of something, that's some subtraction. In business terms, gross revenue versus net profit. It's like the total amount of dollars that came in minus the amount of expenses that you had to pay in order to get that money in. And what that leaves at the end of the day is some net profit. In the world of carbohydrate, the nuance is that technically fiber, indigestible fiber, is a kind of carbohydrate. And so if you are going to list the total carbohydrate content of a product, you are technically going to include the amount of fiber in that number. That is somewhat interesting information if you're shopping for products based on nutritional content, but it's also it can be misleading. And that's because the main reason you want to have a low carbohydrate product is because when carbohydrate is digested and goes into the bloodstream, it does bad, unhealthy things. We've talked about this in lots of other episodes, right? Carbohydrate is a bunch of chains of glucose, gets broken down into individual glucose molecules during digestion and then absorbed into the bloodstream. And that glucose goes into the bloodstream, and that's when all the bad things happen. But sugar goes in. Fiber is a carbohydrate. It's made up of glucose molecules, but it's constructed in such a way that it doesn't get broken down during digestion. So none of the glucose molecules that make up the chains that are fiber actually go into the bloodstream. It just passes through the animal. And so when you're thinking about the healthfulness of it, you don't want to count that, because that's not something, it doesn't impact your dog's blood, doesn't impact blood sugar in any significant way.
Right.
And so, on the human side of the world, where low carb nutritional issues have been discussed by intelligent people for a longish time, that notion of net carbs or digestible carbs has become a commonly used term because that's what matters. That's what you are really trying to minimize. And the AFCO's regulations don't even require any carbohydrate disclosures at this point. So they don't use net. That's not a defined term there in AFCO, net carbs. That's just something that is used commonly enough in the human low carb space that it means something to consumers. So when they say net carbs, what they're referring to are the kind of carbohydrates that matter, the ones that do bad things to your dog, that go into the bloodstream, blah, blah, blah. Another way of saying it is saying digestible carbs. But again, total is inclusive of fiber, which is not digested and so doesn't do nasty things to your dog's body. Net is you subtract that fiber out and it's what's left over afterwards.
Okay.
Makes
I like
sense?
that. Very easy to understand. It's, again, I've only seen on the human side, so that was very interesting. It's not a common, thing that you see on dog food packages.
And I don't think when so AFCO, they actually just had, we're recording this on August 8th. They just had their annual meeting for 22 over this past weekend.
Okay.
And one of the most important subjects that was being discussed is this big, big change to how they regulate pet food labels, which is they're going to begin requiring a nutrition facts panel that looks very similar to what's required on human use products by the FDA.
Right.
Right now, we're talking about all the information that's contained in this guaranteed analysis panel, which is this ridiculous, antiquated nutritional summary that you find on pet food labels, doesn't include a carbohydrate line item. They're finally, decades late, requiring something much more fulsome that isn't going to include good, detailed carbohydrate information. I don't think so. What you've got pulled up here for anybody that's watching this on video is like what Visionary has done. Like this is like reasonably close to what AFCO is going to begin requiring. It's much more similar than the guarantee analysis panel. But I don't think that the net carbohydrate concept is made it into the final regulations. I think you have total dietary fiber, starch, and sugar. I think it would probably be better. I think that it's less misleading to include net carbohydrate because I think that it's not intuitive. We're having to explain this because this isn't common knowledge for everybody. You kind of have to come from the low carb pet food or low carb space to appreciate this anyway. But generally speaking, what they've got there, what you've got on the screen right now that you can find in the bag of this kibble is a nutrition facts panel that looks more or less like what everybody's going to have to include pretty soon.
Absolutely. And I think it's so much easier to read too. When we had recorded,
of course,
another episode, it was our second carb episode, I believe it was, and you were saying you held up a can of your Diet Coke and you were like, I can look at this Diet Coke and know all these nutritional facts about it, but then the dog food, it's certain, nutritional facts.
And it's like it's not even listed in like it. You have to do it. You have to provide your numbers in like limit terms. Like you say, we have at least this much protein in there in the guarantee analysis panel. It could be considerably more than the number on the bag. We have at least this much fat in there, or we have no more than this much moisture in there, but it can be much less. And so it's this, we could do if we wanted to make an episode that nobody would actually ever listen to, like if we wanted to get rid of the 4 or 5 people that do listen to this show and just make it so it's just you and I talking in a vacuum, we could do something on the history of AFCO's regulations, where they come from. And it's not like they came from a place where they were like, we're going to make this as tricky and misleading as possible. There is a logic behind it. It's just super outdated and antiquated and no longer good enough, basically.
We'll do a Dan's guilty pleasure episode.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to circle back to something you said at the beginning of this episode of comparing Ketona with Visionary, and you were saying they're both low carb, but one has, higher fat, one has higher protein. But which is better? Is it higher fat or higher protein? And I know you touched a little bit on ketosis, so I want to make sure we at least kind of cover that of, if you're kind of trying to maximize ketosis, you want to kind of go higher fat, right?
Yeah. So in order to make sure that everybody that's listening understands the relevant context here, so the expression keto is a shortening of a bunch of words that have to do with a metabolic process called ketosis. So ketogenesis it means like the process of making these things, ketones. Ketones are a type of metabolic substrate, a thing that your body and your dog's body produces that can be used for certain metabolic needs. And both you and your dog, the amount of ketones that you produce, whether you are in ketosis or not, whether your body is making these things, is influenced by all sorts of lifestyle and environmental factors. But the one that matters most is, are you taking in carbohydrate or not? If you do not feed a dog or a human being carbohydrate at all, its body will eventually begin producing ketone bodies. There won't be enough, won't be able to make sufficient amounts of glucose to power everything that it would otherwise use glucose for. And so it makes ketone bodies to pick up some of that slack. That's a little bit complicated, but basically that's where the expression keto comes from. It is taken in this day and age, the puppy approaches. In this day and age, he just makes me laugh so much. Like I just look at it. He's so derpy. We need to have the show needs more Wayne. Like it's just like we had him at the dog park yesterday and somebody's like, he's so derpy. And I was like, everybody says that about like just about every dog. Like, oh, they're so derpy. But it's like that St. Bernards look very cross-eyed. Like he looks legitimately cross-eyed. And they often, the ones like they have a turning out quality on their like front limbs.
Yeah, they have like penguin feet. Yeah.
They have penguin feet-ish. Between that and cross-eyed, and he's like a puppy, so he's like these super long, like gangly limbs. He just looks incredibly derpy. Or he just like sits there and just eyes you up, and he's cross-eyed, and his tail is like wag. He just looks like such a moron.
How can you not laugh? How can you?
I do. Well, it just derailed the whole show. But so that's when you see keto on a label. It kind of means two things. It's designed to communicate on two different levels. On one level, the very literal level, what it means is this product will make your dog produce more ketones than something else. Ketosis is not a binary proposition. It's not like pregnancy or like life and death, where it's like you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. There's no in between. Ketosis is like how deep are you in ketosis? At baseline, your dog will produce some amount of ketone bodies, even on a high carbohydrate diet. If you knock down the carbohydrate content completely, if you reduce the calorie intake significantly, if you have the dog perform a lot of exercise, all those kinds of things ramp up ketosis more. But the other way that it's like communicating is it's basically communicating to the person looking at the label, this is low carb. Like keto is so synonymous with low carb that's part of what you're trying to communicate by using that expression. But in a technical sense, what it's saying is this will make your dog, all else being equal, this product will make your dog make ketones more than a higher carbohydrate product. Yeah, it's relevant for this because another thing that will influence how much ketone, what ketone concentration is in the blood is the amount of fat. All else being equal, more fat means deeper ketosis. That's a thing that's well established in the scientific record. And what that means is that if your goal in a big priority for you in choosing a pet food is I want my dog to be in as deep a ketotic state as possible for whatever reason, you want to feed, all else being equal, not just a very low carb food, but also a higher fat food. And so that's the primary justification. If you're like, I choose this product over Ketona, 9 times out of 10, that's your logic. Is you're like, I want my dog to be in ketosis for X reason, as deep as possible. Like, so this is the product for me, because that absolutely will happen. This product absolutely contains more fat. Fat unquestionably does produce more ketones than all else being equal, than less fat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of the basically at a fundamental level, like if you're using that logic, then what you're saying is like there's something good about ketone bodies, that's like they do something healthful themselves. That's not how I view the world. The way that I read the literature, and I don't think this is particularly this isn't really something that feels like there's much debate around, honestly, if I'm being frank, is ketones are an indication that you're doing the right thing. When you feed your dog a low carbohydrate diet, it tends to produce ketones, but that's because the healthful thing, the lowering of the carbohydrate content, the lower blood glucose, tends to produce ketones. It's not that the ketones themselves are some magic elixir. That's not how what I see in the literature at all. But some people do believe that. And those kind of people, this is a product that will support that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And another aspect to this is they have a high protein, recipe. And I want to make sure that we do show on camera, and I can pull up the website as well, is they have the enlightened pyramid, which I thought was like a cute little illustration, but it kind of illustrates everything you're talking about, right? It's like reinforcing the
yeah, right, exactly. So it's a pyramid, and the top is carbs, the middle is protein, and the bottom is fat, right? The blue that you've got on the screen there, the base of the pyramid is fat. It says 55 to 70%, what they call the enlightened pyramid. And so this is what it says: many pet parents feel good about their choices without realizing how much carbohydrate they're actually feeding. I agree with that. When evaluating your dog's food, follow the enlightened pyramid. And the enlightened pyramid is fat 55 to 70%, protein 30 to 45%, carbs 1%. So what I would say is that for my money, that's actually not, I don't think that is as enlightened a choice. I mean, again, to reiterate, you're on an island here, okay? This is not a low protein pet food either, right? But it's considerably less protein than Ketona is. So if what you want to do is not just reduce your dog's carbohydrate as much as possible, but also primarily feed it protein for whatever reason, you prefer Ketona. Like the nutrition has to come from somewhere. There's only 3 different kinds of things that can include caloric energy: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. We're both low carbohydrate. We both agree that the top, the smallest part of the pyramid, ought to be carbohydrate. I just believe that more protein is more healthful than more fat. And the reason that I believe that is that we know without question all these healthful things that protein does do. The like case that like, okay, you're going to feed more fat, not because your dog actually, it's not like a rationale that's like, well, if you give your dog more fat, it's going to use that fat to do A, B, C, and D, which are all healthful things. It's like, feed more fat, that makes more ketones. Ketones are healthy. I don't really buy that. Protein, it's simpler. It's like, feed your dog more protein because it can use and will use in healthful ways more protein than AFCO's minimum. Right. It's like you want to feed your dog more protein because it will use that protein for all sorts of healthy things. And the most glaring thing is for building and maintaining skeletal muscle mass. Lean tissues are built primarily of proteins, and particularly this big tissue, muscle. Your dog is found all throughout its body, right? And muscle is like, I say this all the time, but it's like if body fat is like poison for a dog, if like being fat is bad, and basically what's going on is bad stuff's coming out of the fat tissue. It's secreting metabolically unhealthy stuff. That's sort of the most basic explanation for why obesity is bad. Like, think body fat is poison, muscle is medicine. Like, muscle is the opposite of that. The more of that you have, the healthier the animal tends to be. And that's for a variety of reasons. The problem is that in a variety of cases, dogs aren't just not building and getting more and more muscular, they're actively losing it. So the two most common ones are disease. If your dog has a disease that's very metabolically active, particularly cancer, they will lose weight over time, and they'll primarily lose skeletal muscle mass. And that's a phenomenon that's well established in literature. It's called cachexia, Cachexia. That's like disease-related muscle wasting. Dog is losing musculature, losing medicine. And so in order to slow that down, counteract it, you need to do the kinds of things that are required to build like muscle mass in a dog that isn't experiencing that. So if you wanted to go out and gain muscle yourself, what do? Two things you do. You lift heavy weights and you eat protein. And you eat protein because that's what the muscles are built of. And you lift heavy things or do resistance exercise because that's the activity that tends to that causes the body to want to try to produce, if it has the building blocks to build more muscle mass. The other place where you really need to do that stuff is for dogs that are aging. I'm a 40-year-old man. At my age, this process has already begun. The process of age-related muscle wasting is called sarcopenia. And that's like every day, if I don't eat protein and do some amount of resistance training, my body will lose some amount of muscle mass every day. And the same thing goes with dogs that get older. And, in the same sense that you want to, like, if you want to slow that down, if you want to try to counteract it even, what you need to do is have your dog perform some kind of muscle taxing activity, some kind of, heavy equivalent of lifting heavy weights, and you need to feed it protein, more protein than you would for a dog that you just want to keep its body exactly the same. And you can really see it, probably like boring at this point, but this is, it's like staring me right in the face. So I got to kind of say it. If you, St. Bernards have huge heads. Okay. I have two St. Bernards. One is a puppy. One is a senior. Puppy is 10 months old. The senior is 11 years old. Okay. They have huge heads, and dogs that have that huge blocky head, that's not bone. You want to believe that like they have this kind of like just block bone skull.
Right. Yeah.
That's not it. All dogs' skulls look basically exactly the same. If you go into a museum or go look it up on the internet right now, you can find dog skulls. They're really pointy. The top of the skull is really pointy. It's got like a crest, a ridge at the top of it, much more than a human skull does that's fused together in like a rounded way like this. So all that squareness that you get in like a Rottweiler or a Pit Bull or a St. Bernard, all that difference between the ridge and the big blocky head is all muscle. That's just lean tissue. And so it's why when you see older dogs, and this is what I mean, you can see it in my two St. Bernards. Wayne's head is a horizontal line, boom, block head. Nash's head, he's 11 years old, is much more, even as a St. Bernard, much pointier. And it happened with my Rottweiler too before he passed away. That was like the place you could see he was losing weight the most. You could see that lean muscle mass wasting over time. And it's sad in the way that like, it's just the inevitability of life. Like that happens and you can't stop it forever. But if you believe that slowing that down is important because muscle is healthful, and it is, then you want to feed more protein to power that along.
Right. And not to mention it's our most listened episode, by the way, but it's how much protein does my dog need? We went over that this higher protein, like a lot of these foods are saying like, oh, we're high protein, but this is legitimately, it's a percentage that is a high protein recipe, but it's more natural. It's close to what wolves ate.
Yeah, I thought that's where you're going with it. Yeah. So like that's another kind of distinct point, sort of. It's like a reason why you might want to feed your dog a higher protein diet that's grounded in science is you might say, I'm going to do what Mother Nature intended. I'm going to respect evolutionary development, and I'm going to feed my dog to the extent that I can the way that its ancestors ate for as long as possible. What that means is feeding your dog like a wolf. And what that means is feeding it more than half of its calories from protein. Like when they study gray wolves, there aren't, outside of whales and like hibernating species like rodents and bears, there aren't a lot of high fat animals out there. Most animals in the wild, unfortunately, in civilization, is very much not the case. But in the wild, you don't find like fat animals that aren't hibernating or living in underwater because it's not useful. And so the vast majority of the prey that wolves eat are pretty low in fat content. They're like between 10 and 15% fat content. And so wolves' calories come to a significant degree much more from protein than from fat on the whole. They eat something like 60% of their diet is protein. So if you're just like, look, I don't know anything about the physiology and metabolism of dogs. I'm not going to claim to be an expert in nutrition, but I do know that Mother Nature gets it right more often than not. So I'm going to feed my dog like a wolf. In that case, you should choose a higher protein option too, because that's more natural.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this kind of leads into, let's talk about ingredients, because they're saying it's real meat as the protein source and all that. So let's kind of dive into the actual ingredients in terms of how they list it. And it's true, right? In dog food, in the pet food industry, as well as human food industry, the order in which it is listed is like by weight or by usage, or right? It's so
By
like
weight. Yeah. So
weight.
like the first ingredient on the list is the thing that if this bag weighs 3.5 pounds, the highest fraction, if I list all the ingredients individually, the highest fraction of that 3.5 pounds comes from the first ingredient on the list and then goes down throughout the list.
Okay.
I will tell you, when I founded the company Keto Natural, I did not know how much shenanigans was possible there, but let me tell you, there are huge shenanigans that are possible and are taking place all the time there. It arguably runs afoul of the too boring rule, but like basically kibble is made by taking the moisture out of something. And so whether or not you're counting that moisture in your ingredient before it goes on the list or after can make the list look incredibly different, because lots of ingredients are full of moisture, whereas other ones are very low in moisture. So obviously that amount of water impacts the weight of the thing hugely. And
Right.
so like you can have, oh, wow, there's meat at the top of this list, and yet it's a 20% protein product. It's like, how can that be? That makes no sense. And the answer is basically because they're counting all the weight of the water in there. But that's an aside.
Yeah, no, I think this is all fascinating.
It's all live.
So let's talk about the first ingredient listed.
Yeah. So the first ingredient is what's called chicken meal. And there, for my money, the nutritional content is what matters much more than the ingredient content. When scientists like study what different food and eating strategies do to the body, they study it from the perspective of nutrients. The ingredients are only significant insofar as they contain nutrients. There's no like organ that in your dog's body that like uses chicken or uses like, kale or whatever. What it uses are the nutrients, macronutrients like fat and carbohydrate, and micronutrients like vitamins and minerals that compose those ingredients. And so for that reason, that's the stuff that actually matters. Ingredient list, every pet owner wants to read I was just thinking about this the other day. The practice of primarily evaluating pet food products by looking at the label and looking at the ingredient list, that's like the most common. If you're somebody who fancies yourself a responsible consumer of pet food products, in all likelihood, that is your strategy. You get a new product and you flip it over and you go look at the ingredient list, and you're behaving completely logically, of course, right? Like you want the information, and the ingredients is a reasonable source of information. And because the actual nutritional content is so ridiculous, this guaranteed analysis thing that's like, it's hard to understand, it's missing information, it's misleading, it's minimums, not accurate numbers. People just go to the ingredient list instead because that's something you can get your head around. If it had a clear statement of nutritional content, I think this would be much less significant. But anyway, people do look at the ingredient list. And if you are somebody that says that's the most important thing to me, the number one ingredient on this product, I mean, like a few things to note about the product. Number one is that the number one ingredient, top of the list, is a animal product. It's what's called a byproduct, which is to say you start with an agricultural animal, in this case, chicken, and through processing, you're going to include stuff like this. Chicken meal is like processed chicken parts, basically. But so is the ground chicken that you buy from the butcher to use to make chili. That's chicken where you start with some specific parts and do some processing. You grind it. What parts and what kind of processing is what separates chicken meal from outright chicken. And chicken meal falls in the camp of byproducts. There are consumers, pet owners, who are like, that means bad. I do not want to feed my dog any byproducts. I only want to feed them whole animal ingredients, chicken, beef, none of the byproduct type of things. There's not often, you don't see the word byproduct. You see the word like meal instead, but they're a broader class of products or ingredient called byproducts. I am not somebody that thinks that matters. There is no science that says nutritionally they might be the same, but a byproduct is less healthy for your dog anyway. That's not out there. No one's ever run a study that shows that. Where look, all else being equal, it's like if the protein, fat, micronutrients, blah, 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 all that's the same, but one's chicken meal and one is chicken, there's no difference. No one's ever shown any different impact on the animal. But they do feel different. You know what I mean? Like when we talk about what kinds of chicken parts can go into chicken meal, you wouldn't eat it. You know what I mean? I wouldn't eat it. It would feel gross to me. And so it feels bad. And you might feel like you don't want it to be fed to your dog either. So emotionally, your brain might be like, no, that's not good. But it's not backed up by the science. So I'll just tell you that, and there's arguably, I'll, take it even further. You want to be environmentally conscious, make choices that are not just good for you and your dog, but are good for society more broadly. You should support the use of byproducts in pet foods, because otherwise all that stuff is getting thrown away. Something like 70% of the tissue in every slaughtered animal or more, maybe, I don't have the fact on the top of my head, is not sold for human consumption, is not good enough for people according to the USDA. So you're talking about either throwing that stuff away or because it's nutritionally identical to other parts. And the dog obviously doesn't have this same disgust response. There's no dog out there that's like, oh, wait a second. This doesn't feel good enough for me. That's not a thing. Arguably it's more ethical to like lean heavily into that stuff. It's wasteful otherwise, right? Yeah. But if you're somebody that's like, because you told me right before the show, you were like, no, it feels gross to me. I'm not into it. It feels
gross.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just imagine all like the ligaments going in, like the skin, like all the, as a human, things that I would shy away from, where I'm like, I don't eat this in my everyday diet. But then when you think about like the raw diet or wolves in the wild or their evolutionary.
Yeah, there you go.
They ate whole animals. They didn't just pick off chicken breast and chicken thighs and toss away the cartilage. It was everything, and they gnawed on the bones and, they, so it's kind of like taking out, like you said,
it is 100%, but it's notable, it's like so I got their bag here again, and you can see the image that they use for the, often right? People make pet food and they put an image of the primary protein source on there. So you've got what is clearly a chicken breast,
A grilled
white meat,
chicken breast.
grilled, sliced. That's not the type of chicken that's in here, but it's not the type of chicken that's in any kibble pet food. It's worth noting that. That's not like the difference between what counts as chicken meal on the label and what counts as chicken on the label is not as different as you might think. It is not. And, you know, like we were saying before this show, it feels nice to look at a chicken breast sliced up like this. But if you were to try to turn that product into kibble, if you're trying to blend chicken into other ingredients in a way that makes a single kibble, we start thinking about that. It's like, oh man, no, it needs to be broken down hugely. Like, you know, we were talking earlier about broth, like chicken broth. Like it needs to be like that. It needs to be this really consistent, mixable type thing. And you obviously a chunk that you and I would just take a bite out of isn't like that. If you just put a bunch of, I don't know, flour and eggs and liquid into a bowl and then drop cuts of pieces of diced up chicken and run an egg beater over it, you don't just get an even mixture that you can bake a chicken muffin out of. You know what I mean? You get a bunch of chunks of chicken and then the floating what other. And so it's not the case that everyone wants you to see what's in there as this.
Right.
It's not that. It's not that. And fortunately, your dog doesn't care. And fortunately, it doesn't impact its nutrition either way.
Yeah, I guess that's the most important thing to come out of this, right?
Of course.
They're basically bringing in chicken flour. It's dehydrated chicken parts, so the byproduct, and then also the actual chicken. But it's the moisture has been removed in order to be able to evenly combine it with all these other ingredients in order to extrude it, in order to make kibble. But the nutrition analysis happens after the kibbles is made. So it's not like it's destroying everything and it's coming out the other end with lower in protein or like, you know, really any change, I guess, you know,
it does. There's meaningful change that when you heat something up, if you heat up nutritional substrates, they will change. There's like denaturing. There's some degree of change that takes place there. Just like your dog ingests carbohydrates, long chains of carbohydrate molecules, and during digestion breaks it down into glucose. So there is some degree of change. It's going to change depending on how exactly it's processed. But you hit the real point. Number one, I mean, it's not. This is not. You don't turn something green into something red through there. We're not talking about night and day differences. But the more important point is any responsible pet food company is doing the analysis after the production is done. Not everybody does that. It's important to note, not everybody does that. I think that's misleading. It's not what you should be putting on the bag, but AFCO will let you do that.
Okay.
So you should ask your brand what it uses. Like you can be AFCO compliant by just being like, I plugged in these ingredients into this accepted industry database that says chicken contains X grams of protein per, and added all of our ingredients together and pressed return. And this is the number that came back. I'm going to sign an affidavit that says this is what's in there. AFCO's like, cool, that's good. That's not what we do. That's not what we do. I don't think that's because we were talking about how we'll probably run a show about what extrusion is and how it works and what does it mean? Is it bad? Is it good? Blah, blah, blah. A lot of folks out there hold the belief that if you extrude it, it becomes bad. And the most common idea that they use for explaining why you extrude it, then it equals something bad, is when you heat it up and you put it through extrusion, the nutrients like break down and go bye-bye. And again, it happens to some extent. It's minimal. But the more important point is if you test what's in there after that is complete, then it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Okay, yeah, it had 60% protein before I put it in, but I'm telling you it's 58% because that's what it was afterwards.
Right. Oh man, so fascinating. I'm learning more and more about these little, like meat nuggets that come out of the, all these plants for kibble, because I guess I just had this different process in my mind, but it is so true of everything has to be set up a certain way in order to make it hold together and all that. But at the end of the day, it's all about the nutrition that's delivered to your dog. And anyway, so it's always interesting. I'm like, okay, that's a good reminder.
It's like this is not a pet food process, extrusion. It's a food production process, and it's used in foods that you probably have eaten today, certainly over the course of a week. Everything from pasta, breakfast cereals, bread products, snack products, stuff like that. Anything that's kind of in a shape that you don't find in the wild, that is a product that has in all likelihood been produced through extrusion technology. They mix all the ingredients together, add some hot water, steam, squeeze it out through the little cutter, and make little parts.
And voila.
Voila, got some noodles.
Well, good. Well, this was a really good recap on visionary pet foods. Visionary keto pet foods, I believe, is the full name, which we talked about. This is why they use keto in their name. And this was just a really good recap on why they're using certain terminology and went through the nutritional analysis and all about this kibble that Dan's dogs are just absolutely dying to at least.
Oh yeah, he's trying to eat it. Yeah, can I mention two other things? These are not on the substance, but they're like relevant. Number one, at present, August 8th, 2022, Visionary makes two flavors. They make chicken and they make beef, white meat and red meat. They don't make a seafood one. Keto Natural, on the other hand, makes a chicken and a salmon. We make a white and a seafood. We don't make a beef. We don't make a red meat one. Maybe by the time you're listening to this, both those things will have changed. It's certainly in the plans for us, but at present, that's another thing that's different between the two. And then the last thing is that Visionary is associated in a way that I can't pinpoint. I couldn't speak intelligently about the specific association, but there is an association between Visionary Pet Foods and this organization called the Keto Pet Sanctuary. And there you go. That's it. They refer to it. Yeah, exactly. This language of inspiration is also on the bag. We're inspired by, which kind of always like puts me on guard because it's very commonly used. We talked about it in the Blue Buffalo episode where it was like, they don't say feed your dog Blue Buffalo. It's the same as a wolf would eat. It says it's inspired by the diet of a wolf. And it's just this kind of wishy-washy, a little bit mealy-mouthed, like, no, it doesn't. I'm not telling you it's exactly the same. I'm saying it's inspired by. It's in some way linked there. So it always gets my hackles up, or it always puts me on guard a little bit because the Keto Pet Sanctuary is an organization that's existed for a while now. I think it's at least for something like 8 or 9 years, where basically what they do is they take dogs in that have cancer and they give the dogs very ketogenic diets in with the hope that it will be efficacious in helping with cancer, help them slow the progression of the cancer or eradicate the cancer. And there's a whole school of thought that supports that kind of strategy, that cancer is a metabolic disease and that you should reduce the amount of dietary carbohydrate, up the amount of ketosis in order to reduce that. And so before there was a Keto Natural Pet Foods and before Visionary was making kibble, there was a Keto Pet Sanctuary using this ketogenic diets as part of a metabolic therapies for treating cancer. They did not feed Visionary's kibble there. I think that's probably why the inspiration language is used, because otherwise you can communicate like, oh, this is what they feed there. It must be. It's not. Yeah. No, it's not. It existed before anybody was making low carb kibble, and they were feeding like anybody that was trying to do that back then was feeding a raw diet, basically a raw diet, very high in fat content, moderate protein, as little carbohydrate as possible.
Right.
So I think that's probably why it says inspiration. But I do know that there is some degree of overlap there, where some of the ownership is the same, some of the people are the same. There are exclusive partnerships, something that's involved there, because I have met some of the people that work for basically, this again gets pretty far afield, but like Quest Nutrition is primarily a human use food company. They make low carb human products, particularly like carbs products for people who have diabetes. I eat their protein bars. They're very low carbohydrate content protein bars. And I know that Quest Nutrition was involved in the Keto Pet Sanctuary because there's some commonality of founders. Like somebody is on both founding teams, and the companies are related in that kind of way. And I think that it goes through there. But again, I'm not. If any of that is wrong, I apologize. Hopefully, I'm not like saying it in a way that's casting any aspersions. That's not my intention. But that's sort of the nature of the affiliation there. It's like Keto Pet Sanctuary isn't feeding these diets to their dogs, but some of the same people who got Keto Pet Sanctuary up and running have been involved in this too. So
interesting. Yeah, it's kind of reminds me of the Hills episode where we're kind of tracing, all the footprints and the commonalities of ownerships and different
but
things.
it's
Not as deep in the woods as the Hills side, but anyway.
And not the important difference to me is that nobody's trying to be misleading. Like the
Correct. Yeah.
Hills, like there's Hills, and then there's the like information arm of Hills, and the baddest thing is that there's misleading stuff by them that's damaging. And whereas I've never had anything other than, and I talked to folks from the Keto Pet Sanctuary pretty extensively when I was working on my book. Like I've never had anything other than like straight experiences with them. They're really upright, honest, forthcoming, good people that are doing good work. I know that they've like for a long time been trying to do peer reviewable type research. It's never really come and been notable. I think I went to a conference once where they put out like a abstract where they were summarizing stuff that they were hoping to put into a paper, but it never really came into being. And it's a nonprofit, and so it's not like they're running a business. So it's like if they can easily run out of funding, scientific studies are expensive. You can see like how it would be hard to do. But yeah, their heart's definitely in the right place. So yeah.
Well, good. Yeah, they're out there literally saving dogs' lives, or extending dogs' lives at the very
They're trying.
Trying, absolutely. Well, good. Well, we covered a lot. I mean, this was a solid hour of, talking about a brand. But it was good. It's a lot of information around this like low carb segment of the pet food market. So hopefully you learned a lot in this episode. Again, thank you always for listening. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, you can always recommend brands that you would like us to tackle on these label review mini series that we have going on. So just email us. I'll put our email in the show notes, and just send us a brand or two, or have a list of brands for us, and we'll make sure to tackle it next time. So thanks for
listening. And here's another place to engage with your audience is that if you feed Visionary to your dog, or if you're involved with the company and you listen to this and you've got any feedback, if you feel like we're mischaracterizing it, being unfair, got something wrong, whatever, tell us. We're listening. We want to have a conversation with you about it. I don't think we were, but I've certainly been wrong before about plenty of stuff. So we'll correct the record if we are. So I think we're all on the same team there. And so it's like,
open for discussion.
Hopefully there's
Good call. All right. Again, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Holler. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.